Well, welcome to this introductory session focused on key principles for involving peers in advancing inclusion and belonging at your school. I'm thrilled to be your guide as you consider new ways of connecting students with and without autism and other developmental disabilities, both in the classroom and beyond the classroom, in ways that lead to full participation and membership within the life of their school. So whether you are already implementing the peer-to-peer program or you're looking for specific ways to support individual students, this session is for you. Now, your school already offers a rich array of academic and elective classes and field trips, school clubs, activities, events, so much more. And likewise, it's filled with students who are eager to learn about their world, to enjoy new experiences, to make fantastic friends, to grow up in the company of others. What does it look like to ensure that students with autism or other developmental disabilities have and benefit from these very same opportunities? Well, this session will provide you with some of the practices and supports that can lead to inclusion and belonging for all students, including those who have disabilities. And this first session will focus on some of the core principles that can lead you there. So in this session, you will recognize the importance of relationships in fostering learning and meaningful participation. You'll learn a dozen principles that inform why and how we should focus on fostering friendships. You'll identify individual practices that align with these principles, each of which will be covered in later sessions, and you'll discover new resources that can take you deeper. Well, let's start with an overview of these dozen points, and certainly there are others you and I could add to this list, but each reminds us about the needs in our midst, the goals of our efforts, and the ways we might move forward. Now, the first might seem incredibly obvious, but it's worth emphasizing first, right? Relationships matter. Elementary and secondary schooling is a thoroughly social endeavor. And think about it. I mean, each day, hundreds of students with and without disabilities enter your school to learn alongside their peers and from scores of committed teachers. Your classrooms are filled with group discussions and collaborative projects. Your cafeteria reverberates with conversations among friends. And recess, so it offers a respite of play with fellow schoolmates, and those hallways booming with locker conversations and passing exchanges. And of course, there's extracurriculars that connect groups of students who share common interests and pursuits. And there are so few moments during the school day when students are not in the company of others. This is why kids get excited about going to school each day and why they dread sometimes doing so. It's the attraction or it's the source of anxiety. And those interactions and relationships aren't merely about enjoyment and fun, right? They can also have so much impact on the learning of students. Through their interactions with peers within and beyond the classroom, students gain so much. And when we support these well, students experience companionship and a sense of belonging. They access emotional and practical support. They learn peer norms and values. They learn new social and communication, self-determination, and life skills. They increase their self-esteem and confidence. They grow academically and in their knowledge of the world. They have fewer behavioral challenges. They show up more at school. They experience greater well-being and quality of life. These are the good things we want for every student, including those who happen to have more extensive support needs. But relationships are not automatic. Both research and practice remind us that isolation still abounds for far too many students with autism and other developmental disabilities. The social challenges that students with disabilities encounter are often reflected in the outcomes they experience. And hundreds of descriptive and observational and intervention studies all illustrate the paucity of social interactions, of positive peer relationships within and beyond the school day. So many barriers still seem to stand in the way. Now, one way to illustrate this is by thinking about the relationships that we want our students to have. And it can actually be helpful to start thinking about the relationships that you have, that I have. If we wrote down the names of everyone we knew, they would basically fit in 4 categories. We have our family members. We have our friends and close companions, our acquaintances and occasionals, right? The people we see now and then but don't feel particularly close to. And we have those people who are paid to be in our lives, like our doctors and our auto mechanics and our bosses and others. Well, the same sort of relationship mapping is evident to students, is relevant, I would say, to students with autism and other developmental disabilities. What you find is that the majority of names, though, go in those inner circles of family members and those outer circles of paid staff, special educators, paraprofessionals, other teachers, specialists, related service providers, healthcare workers. Those circles of friends and close companions are often thinner and sometimes more fragile. And all 4 of these circles certainly matter, but some of these relationships just remain more rare than others. Let me illustrate my anecdotal point with actual data. These data are drawn from a nationally representative study of middle school and high school students served under a range of special education categories. Now, each of the columns indicates the percentage of students with autism, with intellectual disability, with multiple disabilities that either get together with friends weekly, choosing to do activities with friends, or has trouble communicating by any means. For example, less than a third of students with autism get together with friends weekly, less than half choose to do activities with friends, and half experience trouble communicating with others. Now, this portrait is not altogether different in elementary school. For example, only 1/3 of students with autism have not been invited to other kids' social activities. Only 1/3 get together or get along with other students very well, and nearly half sometimes experience loneliness at school. These kinds of findings present a complex and challenging portrait of the social experiences of students with disabilities. And although some students are thriving socially, many more are struggling in this area. Well, third, friendships are not automatic, and neither is inclusion. Here, too, the landscape is uneven from district to district, from school to school, and from student to student. The opening pages of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act includes these important words. Almost 30 years of research and experience have demonstrated that the education of children with disabilities can be made more effective by having high expectations for such children and ensuring their access to the general education curriculum in the regular classroom to the maximum extent possible. It's now nearly 50 years of research and experience that tells us that this is an area worthy of our investment, a set of practices worth pursuing. And if we aren't intentional, well, nothing changes. Consider educational placement data from your own state of Michigan, and think about the incredible array of classes that you offer to students at your school. For many students with disabilities, absence from general education classrooms is just more common than presence. On your screen, you'll see the percentage of students with various disability categories placed in different settings: intellectual disability, autism, multiple disabilities, and the last column is all students receiving special education combined. So here's the percentage of students in separate schools or other settings outside of the local public school. And here is the percentage of students who spend 40% or less of their school day in general education classrooms. Here's the percentage of students who spend a mix of time in special education and general education classrooms, which is about 40 to 80% time in general education. And here's a percentage of students who spend most of their day in general education classrooms, 80% or more. For students with more extensive support needs, such as those who are on the alternate assessment, the separation is all the more pronounced. Now, a whole constellation of barriers can coalesce to limit access to inclusive education, right? There's the characteristics and needs of your students. There's the attitudes and awareness of peers. There's often the overpresence of paraprofessionals, the overall service delivery models of your district, or even our own expectations or limited vision of sometimes what's possible. Each of these become a place for us to address attention so that exclusion becomes the exception rather than the rule, or goes away altogether, right? As Michael Giangreco at the University of Vermont has astutely observed, for every student who remains educationally segregated, there are other students with similar attributes and abilities and needs who are successfully included. This simple fact suggests that whether a student with a disability is meaningfully included may have less to do with his or her characteristics and more to do with the attitudes, the skills, the structure, and the practices of adults responsible for providing education. Well, yes, inclusion matters, but more and more I wonder if this is the chief end of our pursuit as educators and school leaders. Is there something more that matters, something beyond inclusion? Well, I'm convinced that the name for that designation is belonging. Every one of us longs to belong, and the same is true for your students. Now, let me illustrate this by reminding you of our changing postures over time. When I was born in the early 1970s, so many students with disabilities found themselves wholly excluded from public education, and also so many other community opportunities. So you imagine each of these circles reflects a member of a particular school or other community. There were holes. Too many students were still missing. And as our advocacy and our reform efforts advanced, as new legislation and policies and practices were pursued, the opportunities that emerged for students with developmental disabilities tended to be offered in largely segregated contexts, entirely apart from anyone else who didn't have a similar label as you. And that meant, of course, that most students without disabilities would grow up and receive their formative education in the absence of their peers with disabilities. Now, over time, that landscape began to change further toward ensuring that students with disabilities were integrated or mainstreamed within ordinary aspects of school life. And this was incredible progress, but the opportunities that opened up still involved a certain separation, right? Different classes down a rarely traveled hallway, separate tables in a crowded cafeteria, and on and on and on. Individuals with developmental disabilities were near, but not really among their same-age peers without disabilities, right? Near, but not really among. Which takes us to the present day, where our emphasis nationally and internationally is focused on ensuring people with disabilities are included in the same classrooms and clubs and cafeterias and community activities as anyone else. That's been the theme of the last 2 decades, inclusion, and it's a movement of prepositions as well. We're shifting from being apart from one another to being among one another to being with one another. And students, though, they tell us that they want to be more than just integrated. They tell us that they want to be more than just included. There's something further, something beyond. They want to belong. And this is the designation that I think we're asked to pursue. Each of us would affirm that our schools should be places of belonging for every student. We hope that our students feel at home in their classrooms and true members of their schools. We want them to feel valued and accepted and needed by their peers and teachers. We strive to create these connections that lead to reciprocal relationships and friendships. And so belonging entails changing how we see one another, not as those who are labeled, those who aren't, those who need support, those who don't, but every student as having equal, even incredible worth and value. And it also means that we do more than share space, right? Students share their lives. And kids with or without disabilities still spend time together after class ends, after the school bell rings, all 7 days of the week. And friendships start to abound. And that, of course, leads to the 5th point. There is a friendship formula. Well, I mean, we can't make kids be friends with one another, certainly, but we can create the opportunities needed for them to encounter one another, to spend time together, and to pick one another as friends. And we can also design schooling in such a way that there's almost no opportunity for anyone else in that school to come to know and like and befriend students with developmental disabilities. But there is sort of a formula, I suppose. Most friendships form through being part of shared activities with people who have common interests and doing that repeatedly over time. And I would add support and valued roles to this list as important additions for students who have more extensive support needs. Common interests are the workaround for other barriers. So you think about all the students that you serve. What do they love to do for fun? What shows do they enjoy watching? What music do they listen to? What hobbies do they pursue? What sports do they follow? What places do they love to spend time? And then you ask yourself, who else in this school loves some of those very same things? Who can help me find those other kids in our school? See, connecting students around common interests and shared activities aligns with this overarching idea of creating a medium of exchange activities. But there's also a fuller formula I think that we should consider. And ask yourself, are students with and without disabilities involved in shared activities throughout the day? Are students with and without disabilities in close proximity within those shared activities? Are they being connected on the basis of their common interests and experiences? Do students with disabilities have a reliable way of communicating with peers during those activities? And are students serving in valued roles within those shared activities? Do peers without disabilities receive the relevant preparation they need so they're comfortable and competent in any support roles they have? And are students with disabilities provided just enough support by adults so that they can participate meaningfully but not in intrusive ways? And are we as educators regularly reflecting on whether the supports and interactions students have lead to desired outcomes? As you reflect on each, consider how you would address these questions. Right? What are you doing really well right now? What could you be doing better or more of or differently? And what could you begin doing next to have the best impact at your school? Now, we've uploaded a short reflection tool that you can use with your team at school to consider each of these 8 areas as well. Now, as I've already alluded to, the ways we choose to support students in their classrooms and throughout the school day makes a major difference in their experiences and outcomes. There are supports that can be enabling and those that are hindering. There's supports that can be helpful and supports that can be harmful. And we need to know the difference as we think about the students we serve and the settings that they're in. And likewise, the supports we provide have to be revisited over time as our students grow up and encounter new environments. Now, one primary consideration relates to whether we rely heavily on classmates and schoolmates or we rely heavily on school staff, like paraprofessionals and therapists and special educators, often to the exclusion of peers. It's this risk we always run of finding the right balance rather than drawing on one to the exclusion of others. And there are some compelling reasons to draw on peers as we work towards inclusion and belonging. I mean, peers naturally turn to one another for support. It's a normal everyday experience, but one that students with some disabilities can miss out on. And peers are often the kind of experts on social skills and other social norms, for better or worse. For peers can shape things in ways that we as adults just struggle to do. Peers aren't always as stigmatizing as adults, particularly in middle school and high school, and peers are great problem solvers and can be quite creative. They're widely available, ubiquitous, free, and peers can benefit themselves, which we'll talk about in point 11. And finally, peers are future employers and coworkers and neighbors and congregation members. On the flip side, we want to be careful that the adult support we arrange does not inadvertently set students apart or decrease contact between students and general educators or other group leaders. We don't want supports to hinder student learning and achievement or encourage unnecessary dependence, or even limit interactions with classmates or lead to misaligned instruction, or impact students in other negative, unanticipated ways. Now, my own research team is focused on evaluating 3 practical ways of involving peers in supporting students with disabilities in inclusive classrooms, in cafeterias, in extracurriculars, and even in community experiences. These are peer-mediated approaches that go by a variety of different names depending on the setting, and they'll be the focus of subsequent webinars. But in every single study we've conducted, we found noticeable advantage when students with autism and other developmental disabilities receive support from same-age peers without disabilities versus support exclusively from adults. Now, this work is important because it can change the trajectories of young people, but it's also really challenging. It takes time and effort and creativity and advocacy to spur the sort of changes you're hoping to see in your school. Now, collaborative teaming is critical to the success of inclusive education. On the screen are some of those others that I mentioned earlier. If we're going to support inclusion and belonging for students with autism and other developmental disabilities, typically we've got to figure out how to engage special educators and general educators, paraprofessionals, related service providers, and other school staff, all of whom have to work collaboratively to identify and address a student's social and learning goals. And all of the peer-mediated support strategies we'll discuss in this series are going to require joint assessment. This is not a place to go it alone. Now, I recall once hearing the leader of a community program saying, it's not that we deliberately excluded people with disabilities. We weren't deliberate at all, and that was the problem. I suspect the same is true of our schools. The absence of intentionality leaves some things overlooked, and the antidote to oversight is careful planning. Just as you plan for the academic and behavioral needs of your students, so too should you plan for their social-related needs. Person-centered planning should always be individualized to particular students, contextualized to different settings, and broad enough to include the social aspects of schooling. So consider how active planning in the area of social relationships might be incorporated into your planning for general education participation and extracurricular involvement and elsewhere. Now, as part of our plans, it's also important to make sure that we're equipping peers to be good classmates and schoolmates and friends. You see, their awareness of and attitudes towards others may impact their receptivity towards spending time and developing friendships with someone who has a disability. Limited knowledge about disabilities, uncertainty about how to interact with someone who has complex communication needs or behavioral challenges, questions about someone's capabilities, all of these things make sometimes peers reluctant to initiate interactions or pursue relationships. And reluctance almost always leads to avoidance. Now, in some cases, providing accurate and relevant information can help ensure that students feel confident and skilled in their interactions. So think about what information someone might need before getting involved in a shared activity. Is it information about one another, about the activity and the people who are available to help, or about something else? Now, my sense is that this type of information is most helpful, again, when it's individualized, when it addresses specific information about the students with whom they will be spending time, and when it highlights the expectations of a particular activity. In other words, broader disability awareness efforts may not have the same impact on relationship formation as more individualized and targeted information. So as we collaborate and plan and engage peers, it's also important that we collect good data that can tell us whether our social-focused interventions are working well or they need further refinement. So collect summative, informative data focused on the implementation and outcomes of the intervention strategies that you use. Remember that approaches that are identified as quote-unquote evidence-based practices within the literature are still never guaranteed to have the same effects for your students. Local impact must always be evaluated using data-based decision-making. And of course, equipping students with disabilities to thrive socially can be complex and challenging. And when we talk about the social domain, we mean lots of different things. So promoting student success in this area is going to require attending to multiple dimensions of their social experiences. So here's some areas in which we often work to see change. And each of these can be noticed and tracked and acted upon if we collect good data. Social skills refers to that collection of interpersonal behaviors that students use in their daily interactions with peers and teachers and other school staff. It's about being able to communicate effectively and work collaboratively or resolve conflict or establish friendships. And social interactions are those communicative exchanges between students throughout the school day, the brief exchanges all the way to extended conversations and everything in between. This is how students offer and receive social support with others. And then there's social participation, which means students have an active and ongoing involvement in inclusive activities right alongside same-age peers at their school. This might involve extracurricular activities or after-school events or school programs, field trips or academic and elective classes, just like anyone else. And then there's social relationships, right? The personal connections that students develop and maintain with others over time. They range from casual acquaintances to teammates to clubmates to close friendships, even romantic partners. And then there's social acceptance, which is about being viewed positively by others in your school, accepted wholeheartedly. It's fostered through interactions and relationships. And finally, which we've talked about already, there's belonging, that assurance of acceptance and value and membership within a particular community. As the great Yogi Berra reminded us, you can observe a lot by watching. And it's definitely true in this area. You can learn a lot by also talking to students and peers and staff and others about the differences that they're seeing and the supports that they need. So determine what data will be collected and how you'll steward those data well to make the best decisions about where to go next. Now, as you collect your data, don't overlook the impact your efforts might be having on peers without disabilities also, who have the opportunity to learn alongside and get to know their classmates and schoolmates with autism. All of the approaches we will discuss in the series are mutually beneficial when done well, right? Reciprocal. They're win-win in that sense. And the research is quite clear that peers without disabilities also report substantive benefits from being actively involved in and actively supporting efforts to foster inclusion and belonging. Those peers talk about developing new friendships, about having a greater appreciation for diversity, about increasing in their awareness of disability issues and developing new advocacy and other skills. They talk about experiencing personal growth and a sense of accomplishment, of developing greater self-esteem and having fun. And some even develop a new interest in pursuing careers or impact in this field. And maybe that was some of your stories as well. But the point is that there's a reciprocity to these approaches, and we want to capture that reciprocity well. And that leads, of course, to the last of these 12 key principles. Tell a strong story. If you have sharpened your goals and you've found good collaborators, you developed individualized plans and equipped students and their peers, you've provided the right supports, you've collected relevant data, you will be able to tell a compelling story about the differences that are taking place at your school. If you can, show the story using video and student and staff testimonials. Include concrete examples of what happens when schools go all in on inclusion and belonging. This may be key to captivating others at your school or your community and inviting them to join in your efforts. Well, there you have it, a dozen points for your reflection and action. And to close it out, let me simply say that this is important work. This is intentional work. It's long-haul work, but it's doable work. It's collaborative work, and you can do this work. What an incredible position you're in to change the landscape for students in your school. So if you're interested in reading more about this topic as you consider how to move forward, consider any of these resources on your screen, some of which are free online. And of course, don't forget about the START Project website, which offers a wide array of practice and research-based resources to help you and guide you all along the way. So thank you for your deep commitment to promoting the flourishing of your students in all the ways that matter most, academically, behaviorally, socially, and so much more. We are grateful for all that you do and all that you give to help your students thrive in so many different ways.